Hi everyone, welcome to episode 2.
Hello, listening.
Today we are talking about electoral systems. Yeah. It's that time of the year when we are really getting into the crux of the matters that we want to discuss in local government. So today I'm joined by my co-host Nosipo, and we've got a very special guest, Ebrahim Fakir. Yeah.
I'm not sure about special.
No, you are. I mean, Ebrahim, you're a political analyst. He's quite popular out there.
I think the reason I'm special is I'm sitting between two women.
That too, okay? That's
Exactly. So Ibrahim will take us through to our discussion today. As you know, the last episode we spoke about local government systems in terms of where we come from when it comes to the kind of system we have in local government. So Trevor Fowler informed us of the historical formation of local government. He actually told us exactly how we ended up with this kind of local government system, how it was negotiated, and he actually briefed us a little bit about the kind of problems that we are starting to see emerge, which did not resonate with their thinking back in the days in the 1990s. But obviously, we need to understand exactly why it is important for us to have elections at local government systems. And obviously, Ibrahim, a lot of people don't understand how electoral systems work. And obviously, we have also seen that the electoral outcome over the years has really dipped down, which says a lot about our local democracy in terms of consolidating and deepening democracy. So, why elections?
Well, ideally, sure. It would be nice to think that we can get away with making decisions and distributing resources that are going to govern all of us collectively in some other way. We'd all like to be part of it. At every time, we have to make a big decision, particularly about how we want to use our collective resources. Right? So it would be nice if we all could, but we can't. The scale of modern society is such that it's almost impractical to be able to participate in every single decision that you do. Except, of course, if you're Switzerland, where every kind of decision is put to a mini referendum for even on a local community. But that's hugely expensive. It's very time consuming, and it really does require very serious administrative management and logistical resources. But also the nature of the country is such is that it's almost a federated system where power is devolved and decentralized to such a great extent that you can do it. But quite importantly, I think in societies like that, people are more or less equal, and they're also relatively homogenous. Given our country, given our history, the history of colonialism, of apartheid, inequality that persists. Imagine someone, and here I have to admit that I'm relatively middle class. I'm inordinately more influential or powerful, I'd like to think so at least, than someone coming from even my own community who never had the benefits and advantages I did. So they're much less influential, right? And then you create inequalities of participation. They have less resources, they don't understand the procedural requirements, and so on and so forth. They don't have the communication skills, whatever. So we got to devise a different system. And that system is we choose people to represent us. That means we delegate some responsibilities to them, and we mandate them to engage in certain decisions on our behalf. But that doesn't mean we leave them alone. We expect them, both because they are a delegate, they represent us, and they have they carry a mandate from us. They are meant to be answerable to us. They have to tell us. Not only are they answerable, they also must explain to us. In the fancy language, we call that accountability and answerability. Right? So they must answer to us. But they must also answer fine to their parties, from wherever they come from, their communities. That's one level. When they are in public institutions where the decisions are made, once you make a decision, someone has to put that decision into action to implement it. When they implement it, you have to supervise or oversee them. We call it oversight. And that's why we have elections, because when you enter in an election, that I choose either one of you, and I would like that for you to be a public representative. I don't leave you to your own devices.
No.
And that's the very reason why you must not talk about elections in isolation from oversight and accountability.
And actually, talking about the way in which councillors are elected, we know that there is a proportional representation of councillors, and there's also ward councillors. So take us back a little bit, Ebrahim. How does the system work, and why did we choose this system? Because one of the things that are prominently coming out is that councillors are not representing the interests of their community. They are actually fixated with representing interests of their political parties. So this, invariable distinction, how does it fit within our democratic system? So just take us back a little bit in terms of the reasoning why we had to settle for PR system and board system.
Okay, so I think let's take a step back, right, and follow up from something I was just saying before. What is the electoral system? The electoral system basically is the system or the process by which we come together collectively to elect, to put those people in place.
Yeah.
So the system by which we do so is very important.
Yeah.
So you were talking about PR and you were talking about wards, and those are all very technical terms. Right? So basically,
Want to unpack them, yeah.
we'll unpack them in a moment, but let's just again revisit this question. We're all coming together. Now we're choosing these guys to put in place, and girls. We're choosing them to put them in place, to make decisions on our behalf, distribute resources, and then explain to us why they did what they did, and oversee those people who actually action the decisions, right? So the process by which we do so is vital. It is vital because depending on who's included and who's excluded will determine how those people feel
Exactly.
and who they feel they are answerable to, right?
Yes.
So the basic question we got to ask, and our constitution is very good, we include as many people as possible. No one's excluded on the basis of race, gender, income, sexual orientation, ability. None. We have a very inclusive system
Yes.
and accommodating.
So then what happens if the inclusive process at a country level, then you find that at a political party level, it's not as inclusive?
Now here's the thing. Our system is far too party oriented.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is not oriented to accommodate and cater for the interest of us as voters and citizens. Our system is devised in far too a party-centric system. So how did we come about there? Again, let's take a step back. When the negotiations occurred, remember negotiations occurred because there was almost literally a stalemate of struggle, of protest,
Absolutely.
of resistance. And the apartheid government was being supported by many international forces. Let's make no mistake about that. Everyone, today committing to be Democrats and committed to the rule of law, not realizing that the content of the actual law was fairly unjust.
Of course.
But in the international system and locally at that time. Anyway, the protest, resistance, and struggle was kind of making headway, but it was rendering the country relatively unstable and so on. So now we decide, gosh, we got to accommodate the fact that we've got this historical contingency, which is shaped by historical forces beyond ourselves.
Yeah.
We can't now objectively go and change those factors. They are an objective factor you have to deal with. On the one hand, if we're shaped by history, we've got this inequality, we've got this history of exclusion of black South Africans. And it's not just exclusion, by the way. Apartheid was a dual operation. Exclusion, separation, and exploitation.
Absolutely.
That's what it was. So now you've got to address that, which was created and conditioned by history and the system. So you want to reverse all that. At the same time, create equality of participation, because it was not, the negotiations were not about retribution. They were about accommodation and redistribution. So now we got one set of historical factors to deal with. we now also got the reality that we want to equalize this highly unequal situation.
Yeah.
How do we do this? So if we give everybody their vote, which is counted equally, the fear was that minorities, not minority opinions, but minority populations on the basis of race, let's just call it what it was. They were fearful that if we go for a system which is going to equalize the votes to such an extent that you will be electing people in direct constituencies, Africans would dominate, or blacks would dominate. And here when you talk about minorities, unfortunately, you have to include Indian and colored South Africans because they were, apartheid constructed the terminology. But the bigger definition of black was that even though all of them would be considered black, they would, in the black strata, be dominated by Africans in particular. And the whites would have felt that they were completely excluded. So how best do we devise a system? Well, let's do it through organizations. Let's make the system one which will accommodate parties. Little did we know that parties can turn out to be organizations which are capricious, which are self-interested, which are inward-looking, which explains the fractionalism, and so on. So there was a reason why this proportional system was used, so that those who feel that they are a minority, either in opinion or by race or by any other cleavage or criteria, they would still have the potential to be included in the system.
But hasn't that happened over time, though, that the voting is almost happening, or for some time happened along the racial lines? I mean, if you think about what happened in the first elections in Durban, there were parties that were only for Indians and then parties for Africans. And there were some parties that were also along the cultural lines, if one were to call it that.
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that identities definitely shape voting preferences to some extent. But that's not the whole story. What would a wealthy black South African have in common with a poor, informal settlement dwelling black South African? Your income levels are vastly different. Your class position is completely different. You're conditioned in different ways. So your political aspirations are going to change. You will not likely vote for the same party. So over time, that has started to shift. At the point of the transition, though, you're absolutely correct. The general assumption, despite the differences within black society and that inequalities created amongst blacks by apartheid, there was more or less an understanding that the significant cleavages amongst black South Africans are not that deep. But 30 years post-democracy, and you can say, in part testament to success of policies of the first couple of years, the redistributionary impulse, class positions have changed fundamentally.
Absolutely.
You have a massive black middle strata, which doesn't share much in common with people at the base of society. You got a non-racializing cosmopolitan elite who don't share the same interests as others. So you do need a different kind of party system now to cater for this. So let's get back to this question. Why parties? Well, we've partly answered the question of why the system was structured and the PR thing, Tina, that you were talking about, right? As accommodating as possible, as inclusive as possible, as proportionate as possible, and as diverse as possible. Fine, we satisfy all those criteria. Are those the only criteria we require now in the society? Because no one is excluded by law. You can have the option of who you want to vote for, so there's some element of diversity. The proportionality question, which is now enshrined in the Constitution in Section 46, 1D, prescribes that any electoral system, any process by which you're going to choose people to form a representative institution and then secondarily a government, must be proportionate. Now, we've read that proportionality thing as a fetish. That we're on a strict mathematical conformity. So there's all kinds of contortions for how you calculate the distribution of seats. That's formula. And I think that's becoming a little bit unnecessary. I think the values are important and we can keep those, but we should move towards a system which will promote not just inclusivity, diversity, proportionality, and representativity, but also one which will incentivize oversight and accountability. Let's take the example stretching all the way from the arms deal through to the denialism that crime is a big problem in society, through to the fact that you had a HIV/AIDS policy at a time in the country which was completely, frankly, upside down, through to the fact that you had corrupt state capture, through to the fact that you have a president who stuffed a sofa with money and there's very little accountability. What incentivized people to protect those leaders? The electoral system. Because there was no accountability, very little answerability. You use your majority to shield your leaders.
Exactly.
Now, had you had people of conscience in those parties who might have felt differently or thought independently, they would still be aligned to the party, but they would have asked more difficult questions. Now, at local government level, where your imperative is both representation, but also actual hardcore development, attract investment, make sure the schools run, make sure there are clinics which run, the roads and infrastructure surfaces are in place. You have the capacity to deliver water, basic services, extend indigence grants, and so on. So you got to do the basic developmental stuff at local level. So there we thought, hey, this proportional business, inclusivity, representativity, is not enough. We need the developmental aspect for oversight and accountability, hence the importation of the ward system. The problem is that the ward system complements the PR system. So people are still interested, as you both rightly point out, in pursuing the interest of the party, not the interest of the people in their community. So I think we now have to change the electoral system, not just nationally, but locally too.
Actually, I like the fact that you are raising a very important point, particularly on the changes, political changes that have arose in South Africa over time. And we've seen those changes when it came to the ANC, electing Jacob Zuma as the president of the ANC. Initially, Jacob Zuma became the president of the country, and his administration over the years, up to the time when he initially left office, was that there was a coincidence when you look at the electoral outcomes and the electoral support for the ANC. And if you also look at that regime, particularly from 2011, now we're going back to the point of elections, electoral outcomes were starting to depreciate. Electoral support was starting to depreciate, particularly for the ANC as the dominant party. Starting from 2011, 2016, it was worse. There was now the introduction of coalition governments. So what I'm trying to trace here is that to what extent has the national predicaments of this country, owing to political instability, factions that have completely alienated the ANC, these factions actually had an implication in local government as well, because ANC structures are based on local government structures. And then it proliferated to creating what we call voter lack of confidence in the ANC. And then you start seeing the downturn of electoral turnout. Is there a correlation?
I wouldn't necessarily say there may be a correlation, but there isn't a causation. So let's just say there isn't a causation. Right? I know the causes are multiple. The correlation, though, is quite clear. Though, let's just go back to also the question of sort of why has this started to decline and why is there factionalism inside the ANC? But let's put this one thought out there. I don't think we should be too hung up on the ANC fracture. I think it's an inevitable, natural attrition of constituencies who shared common interests and now don't. They want to pursue different things. That's fine, so far as that's concerned, right? But I think there's also the idea that some of the factions which were formed inside the ANC were not classic factions as we would understand factions, based on the idea of different ideology, different policy ideas, because those things, those differences, can actually sharpen a political party because there's internal oversight, there's internal contestation over these ideas. These factions were based not on those ideas. These factions were based around material interests and financial interests, if you want to put it that way. And access to the state, because you want to be in office, but you want to be in office and you can in office do many things. You can satisfy yourself, you can balance satisfying yourself with satisfying your constituency or your community, or you can merely be in it to be completely selfless and say, nothing for me, everything for you. That's unrealistic. It's not going to happen. Right? It's also unrealistic to expect or it's unrealistic to hope that the person who is elected in office or who accesses state office will be completely selfless and will not do anything for themselves. They will do something. Now we've got to find rules in which we disincentivize too much of the everything for me and not enough for people and community, but also devise the rules in such a way where you can focus on balancing both, delivering something real and tangible to people and getting a fair reward for what you do. That's not beyond the realm of possibility. We should be able to do that. So now we've got to build a system in a way in which we incentivize both and disincentivize the kind of too much of doing my own thing. And what happened over that period of time, the first 30 years, I think after the first decade, there was a realization that, hey, I can actually use the system. I can manipulate rules. I can manipulate institutions even because of the big majorities that we got.
Exactly.
Now, because you got this very big majority and your fight is not in the public institutions, your fight is inside your home, in your political party. Explains the factions.
But is it even big majorities? Because I want to take you back a little bit, because we're talking about politicians that get into power because of the electorate. And I want you to help me understand at a local level. We're talking about each ward is, how many people need to be registered on the voter roll to form a ward?
Gosh, I have no idea but I mean the general rule would be 100,000 people per public representative. That's on a national scale. On a local scale, I think the scale would be much less, something like 10,000.
10,000. So if we say it's 10,000 and take Joburg for an example, or even Tshwane, they've got about 108 wards, 110 wards, and we're talking about less than 150,000 people representing more than 3 or 4 million people. Can we really say that it is that huge number of people that they draw power from these people, and that's why they're able to stay in power?
Well, no, because we know that formula may be a bit lopsided, but we also know that people who are being elected into office are being elected in smaller numbers, which means that voter turnout is lower, right? And the voter turnout is lower not because people are apathetic or they don't care. South Africa is a very politicized society. Basically, they've lost trust in the process and they've lost trust in the people who are in that process. Now, that you lose trust doesn't mean that the system itself is going to break down. You still have elections, people still go into office, they still exercise public power. At this stage, I think we must say that even, there's this canard that political parties like to put out. If you don't vote for us, don't expect us to be accountable to you. That's not us. Or the other thing, which they like to say at voter education campaigns, if you don't vote, you don't complain. Well, of course you do. You're still a citizen. Your rights are not that you vote, you don't vote, you vote for for blue instead of yellow, doesn't matter. People are still accountable to you and must be answerable to you for exercising public power. They also have to maintain oversight over those people who are implementing on their behalf. So, you see, I don't think this idea that a small number of people are representing a large number of people is itself the root cause of the problem. It's the behavior of the individuals and communities try to hold them answerable. If they aren't responsive, what do? We either protest, we burn stuff, and worse comes to worse, you actually burn the person's house. I mean, there are many examples of mayors and local bigwigs having their houses sort of attacked.
Yeah, and I think that's also why, Tina, there's an SIU investigation on the protection services for politicians, and I think it comes exactly out of that, and it's been in the news recently.
Absolutely. And in fact, one of the things that I also want to bring in as quite interesting when we talk about the electoral system, proportionality and wards, is that when I looked at the statistics, Ebrahim, in 2011, I started back in 2011 because around 2006, there weren't a lot of independent candidates in their numbers. But then from 2011, the numbers started to grow. In 2016, we started to see independent candidates that have actually formed what we call social movements. In other words, getting themselves to be elected as independents under an umbrella of an anti-political organization. So it's sort of like trying to stern this idea that there is now the depoliticization of local government. Of course, we know that politics are actually part and parcel of the game of local government. But then we see this emergence of independent candidates. For me, what does that really tell us about the public confidence in actually having political parties being the main organizers of political organization in a municipality?
Yeah, of course, they don't trust it, right? And the Constitutional Court, in the judgment on the national and provincial election, said you must accommodate individuals, they call independents, outside political parties, because the right to stand for office can't be rooted only to a political party, right? Which is why we had this weird botched national system, which we used for 2024.
Yeah.
But interestingly, I hate to say we have to go back to your very first question. And that is about why do we have these elected people at local government? And you know why that question arises and is important and loops everything back to that? Is there are many systems in the world, including under apartheid, where local government did not actually have a representative and executive function. Local government, municipalities were merely administrative conduits. So you're basically just there to implement things. You didn't make rules, you didn't represent people, there was no council, there was no legislative decision-making powers or anything of that sort. You weren't representing anyone. You were merely there to implement. Some people argue, hey, maybe local government should go back to that system, leave the representation stuff nationally. But I don't know in our country, given how big it is, whether that's feasible to merely make it administrative. But it might be useful in thinking of devolving greater responsibilities, not for representation, but for administration locally. Now, the reason why I think we opted for decision-making representation powers at local level is because local communities can prioritize their own needs better than a top-down national approach. Second, given the diversity of our society at that time of the transition, for example, to come back to this very class dimension, the interest of a local council in, let's say, a local community in Sandton or wealthy Cape Town, Constantia, or Camps Bay, or the wealthy parts of Durban and Umhlanga, and around the country. Those communities, which were largely white at that time, would not share the same concerns and interests and priorities of people in Umlazi or Masho or Alex or Soweto or Kailicha, Langa. I mean, so now how are you going to have a system which can represent them all and accommodate them all,
Yeah.
but also give vent to local priorities? So maybe we were trying to do too much with the local government system. And maybe there's still a need for representation at the local level, but some of it may need to be scaled back and give it more administrative powers and functions and take out the politicization locally. But then we have to live with the fact that you sacrifice local communities' abilities to prioritize what's best for them. But that can well be determined provincially. And then the local implements that on the basis of need, differentiated on the basis of the demographic community.
Yeah.
So that's one option. But it is why we have this weird system. And I think, the Constitution, again, is a hindrance. Because I do think that if you want to keep local government as a representational site, then let's have it as a pure constituency system at local level. Unfortunately, the Constitution says proportionality must be included. So I think there is a way around it. And a way around it is a way around it, and that way around it is to make local government a pure constituency system, take out the PR element. That will also take out the dual sort of powerless ward councillors vis-a-vis powerful PR councillors. But make that the election in a constituency must not be plurality. That means the person who gets the majority votes, or most number of votes rather, and there must be a person who gets the majority. That means 50% plus one. There must be. That will restore some semblance of proportionality. Because the proportionality will not be a strict mathematical one, but it will be broadly reflective. The most number of seats held is cast by the most number of voters.
So, Ebrahim, we've talked a lot about elections, but my contestation in terms of understanding exactly how our electoral system really works for our communities and our citizens is based on the observation that we have seen over the years. And I keep on going back to 2011, 2016. 2021 things had already been like kaput. But one thing that we observed, particularly after the 2011 local government elections, was the outcry coming from communities saying that within their own wards, political parties tend to want to select individuals who make it through the party list, excluding the fact that maybe those individuals are not individuals who are legitimately accepted by the community, obviously based on their political history, their activism, their potential to become representatives. And that has proliferated quite immensely in the 2016 elections. So let's go back to that. I mean, how do these elected councillors emerge so that they end up getting into the ballot paper, and to the extent where some councillors are completely rejected by communities?
Yeah, I mean, look, fair question in the sense that we also need to revisit the idea of political parties as an entity being rational actors, right? Now, these rational actors, what do? They want to maximize what they can gain as a political party. And the first thing you want to gain is you want to get into office. Now, it's counterintuitive to think that if your abiding thing is to get into office, then you're obviously going to put in a person who is popular in that community. Because it stands to reason, that's the easiest, simplest route to get into the office. Right? But we've got two things militating in South Africa. The one is that the PR component, which is the proportional representation component, is entirely determined by parties.
Yes.
It's a party list process in which whatever your internal process in your party is your business. It could be on the ground up from branches. It could be imposed from the top down. It could be an interview process, as if some parties go on as if it's a professional job you're being interviewed for.
So I don't, as a voter, I don't vote for a PR councillor. I vote for the ward council.
Yeah, you only vote for the ward councillor, and you vote for the PR councillor, but through the party. Effectively, you're voting for the party, not the councillor. Of course, the councillor comes in through the party, so they'll tell you eventually, yes, you voted for this person. Theoretically, hypothetically, possibly true, but in reality, the only person you have a hand in choosing directly yourself is that ward councillor, whether they belong to a party or they are in their own name, or independent. You only voted for them. Otherwise, you voted for the party, right? So, on the one hand, now, Tina, as I'm saying, if you think a party would think that the most popular person is the person I must put, but then they think if this person is popular, but they can also be quite independent-minded, and they're not always going to carry out the instruction of the party, and the party actually needs numbers because we want to avoid, appoint contractor A, B, C, D, and E to do jobs X, Y, Z. So now we need the numbers, and we have to show our people are there, and this person, he may be our person on values, or this person, she's with us policy-wise, but man, she might be a bit independent-minded and buck the
and not
what
toe the party lines.
not as strictly as we want her to. So we need to put our own person in. So then they parachute their own person in. So that's one explanation. Look, the other explanation makes a bit more sense, in the sense that you have some parties, and not all parties do this, Municipal. Some parties say we want to balance gender, race, age, income, and then they look at the overall list and then they say, oh no, we've got too many green people, we don't have enough yellow people, and we've got a very rich blue, but we don't have a poorer purple, for example. So they try to balance that, and then someone else creeps in who might not necessarily ideally belong there. But I think that is becoming much less of a criteria, to be perfectly honest. And it's much more extreme nowadays about, can I put in the person who is going to be pliant and pliable to us? Let's also not lose sight of the fact that, unfortunately, given how the system has evolved, bad thinking people, basically criminals, have decided that they can cash in on this thing. And they've started manipulating both parties in institutions, but also individuals. And I think we've allowed this thing to happen for far too long, that it's become entrenched in the system. And until communities are going to stand up against some of these criminal elements which have permeated the political system, you're going to have all kinds of things around the awarding of contracts, tenders, procurement, subcontract, outsourced activities, and so on. Those are all going to be held captive by these groups. Worse still, the poorest people get sort of stymied by these people because you have to pay them dues to get access either to social housing or a plot of land in an informal settlement, if that's going to spring up. So, local councillors and parties, Tina, who are bringing in people who are doing what the party's bidding is, in terms of when they are in the institution, are not thinking carefully enough about what is required to develop communities, especially at local government level. And so I think all the parties must start now revisiting what do they think the purpose of being in local government is.
But it does sound, because you're painting a very gloomy picture.
Sorry.
And no, and you're being very honest in how you're painting this picture. I always look at politics like religion, right? Well, many of them are run like churches. And you think about a church, normal churches, you've got an archbishop, and you've got, it's almost a very similar structure. And in a church system, each church, it either has a book that it refers to on how a person should conduct themselves, or if it's not a book, there's a code of conduct that gets passed down from person to person. But there are those things that even you as a church member or a religious a member of that religion, you'd look at these things and you're like, not too sure about that, but I still identify as whether you identify as this or the other. Now, it sounds like you're saying within that church system, but what happens over time is that there are so many things that people are like, I'm not sure about this, but I'm also not sure about this and the other. But the umbrella body itself, I revere it and I associate with it, and I wonder whether is there an alternative?
Phew. I mean, this is what happens when you have a co-host who has existential questions. Smart questions.
Especially linking them back to religion.
Yeah, I mean, sure. And you're asking someone who can't think a little beyond the immediate. But anyway, let me try. You see, I think what we're doing here is we're saying, okay, fine, you share this set of beliefs, right? And that's okay. That's your ideology. That's your doctrine. And you believe in this. But then there are rules. And in the political game, I think we can call them laws and policies and so on. That's what guides you. Because the ideology is what guides you in your party.
Yeah.
The rules and policies are what guides your behavior in your party and in the institutions, right? Now, if we go back to the discussion we were having a little earlier about democracy and the electoral system and how you are represented, I think we must start to differentiate political representation and democracy from democratic government. And that's where we're falling down on the question of democratic government. So in the process of capturing power, we're all very democratic. We're all very, even parties, right? So you can believe in this religion because it is accommodating, it's inclusive, it gives you voice, it gives you choice, it gives you agency, all those things. So you believe in those things. Now, once you take this belief and your belief has become popular, that means you've captured power, you now have to instrumentalize this. The church has to extend welfare services, ecumenical services, take care of the believers of the flock, do counseling for people who are in distress, couples, whatever, all those things, right? That you believe in the doctrine doesn't mean that the execution of those things are going to be as good as what the doctrine says. The same in politics. Democracy-wise, we look like we're doing great. It's representative, it's inclusive, there's voice, there's choice. You can organize, you can even abuse rights, and we regularly do that, right? Are we translating the power that we got into the proper manner that it's supposed to do? And that's where I think we are falling down. And we're falling down because people are they're using the belief to mask nefarious activities and justifying it on the basis of their belief. So it's like Christians who would have said, it's okay to conquer and subjugate because you're doing it in the name of the Lord and you're bringing them civilization. You're making them good people. But you're not. You use that as a belief to do it, but you didn't actually do that. Politicians and parties are doing the same thing, I hate to say. So we must now craft a set of rules which disincentivize them from doing that. That's for me now the big challenge, is that I think we've got the democracy aspects okay. We don't have the democratic government aspects okay. The limits on the use of power, the limits on authority, the ability to hold people to answer and to account. For those in those institutions to actually exercise deep oversight over the officials who are meant to do things. Right? So why did you do X, Y, and Z? And where you are colluding with your political principles, the bureaucrats, the officials are doing the bidding of their political principles. The political principle can get away with it because they say, no, it's not my fault. It was the official who did it. We don't know that the official has been instructed by the politician. And there are, by the way, instances where the officials are doing so on their own. They are on a frolic of their own. And because they are technically skilled.
Rogue bureaucracies, that's what I call them.
Exactly. And the rogue bureaucracy is part of what's fueling our problems at local government in terms of corruption, in terms of wrong decisions about procurement, about awarding contracts and so on. Because remember, the elected politician doesn't get involved in the actual. They can influence it, sure, and they don't. So they leave it to the bureaucrat, right? Even if they're exercising influence over it. Now what's happened is that if the parties agree that, okay, the bureaucrat may in law have done the wrong thing, but we like it because that's what we want, they will shield them from any scrutiny. Or they've been instructed to do it, or they buy in the politician into the deal.
Yes.
So you benefit. So there are multiple ways in which this thing's happen.
Absolutely.
And you're never going to get rid of it altogether, but you have to devise a system which minimizes that. And for me, that system would be to change the local government system.
Actually, talking about changing the local governance system, I also want to link it to what you spoke about earlier, linking it to oversight. Oversight, and this is very important because as we're about to wrap up our conversation, is the ability for citizens to hold their councillors accountable. We have seen in the past few years that has totally diminished. It's one of the major concerns that councillors are elected. They are expected to hold their ward committee meetings, hold their ward community meetings, whether they do it within neighborhoods or certain geographic locations. They're supposed to report back to these communities, but they don't do that. And on top of that, in terms of serving their oversight roles in council, most councillors are really struggling to do that. And one of the critical factors that have been picked up is that the caliber of councillors that have been elected into power, whether they're coming from the PR system or the ward system, the levels of education is very low. Hence, sometimes it's very difficult for them to even understand the technical committee reports that are coming from the various committees, or even the council reports, which sometimes they are this thick and they're quite technical and detailed. I mean, you should read the financial reports, the infrastructure reports, very, very detailed. But we know, Ebrahim, that our constitution says that we cannot, exclude an individual who wants to be a councillor based on their levels of qualifications. As long as they're a South African citizen, over 18, they are not insolvent, they can become a councillor. So there's a huge cry to say that the quality of our leaders that are being elected through our electoral system is actually leaving much to be desired.
Yeah.
You're talking about reforming local government. How does that issue really permeate
And
local
maybe,
government?
Tina, for local government, almost 25 years on, because it doesn't seem like it's changing. And you could excuse it in the first 10 years. We were all toying with this idea of local government. And I sometimes sit and think that perhaps electoral education should be introduced earlier on before you even decide to be a councillor. So that there are those basic things that you just know how they work at a municipal level. So you don't just come with the party political understanding, but you understand the system of governance. And then at the same time, I'm like, there are organizations that are meant to create that leveling ground for politicians, ward councillors in particular, where they go through the process of induction. And yet what you're saying continues to persist, and I can never get myself to understand why.
Well, if you did, then we wouldn't be sitting here and unravel the secrets of the universe. We would have solved our problems. Unfortunately, I mean, we're all grappling with exactly that. But I don't want to turn this conversation on its head, but because a lot of what you're saying is important, right? But forget the idea of qualifications and skills, and I'll come to that in a moment. Don't you guys agree that we have a much more basic problem? And the basic problem is not so much about your skills or your education level, etc. I think we now have a crisis of conscience and belief. And why am I saying this? Just look at the sheer number of people. Not only high-profile people who are jumping from one political party to another. At local level, this has been happening for a long time.
Yeah.
ask yourself the question, okay, what do you actually believe? There was a local councillor, person who was a big person in the city of Johannesburg, big metro, controlling the GDP of the country, all of that stuff.
70 billion.
Yeah. So now here's this person. They join a political party which says JZ is rotten, is very bad. And that he might have turned out to be that way as a different circumstantial question. But I'm focusing on this individual who says, I joined this party because it stands for the right values. It's got the right principles. Now, and I'm doing this especially because this fellow who was elected to lead the ANC and then subsequently the country is absolutely rotten. So I joined this other party. Okay, I joined this other party. I serve in that party. They elect me. I get into council. I get further elevated to be the speaker of the council. Oh, so after that, I form my own party because that party is no longer a useful vehicle. But what's worse is that I abandon my own party to join the party of the very guy who I said is absolutely rotten. So now, what do you believe? What is your politics? There's no policy issue underlying your decision. This is but one example. There are hundreds of them. Of course, everyone knows the high-profile ones, with people leaving from the EFF to the MK party. But what about the many hundreds of people who are doing this at the local level?
Switching from one party to another. Yeah.
And I'm not saying people aren't allowed this. It's not their conscience. Of course, you're a free political agent. You must be allowed to do this. But when you do something with such high levels of regularity and frequency, we must ask questions about not only those people, but we have to ask questions about ourselves.
Yeah.
We are subsequently electing these people into office. What is this saying about us?
Tina, here's my thing, and right to your point, I've always argued that what we've seen happening in local government when it comes to coalition governments is actually the betrayal of the electorate. Because Tina Nzo votes for Party X because she's got confidence in this particular party. Party gets into office. I subscribe to the value, their Bible, their Quran, whatever you call it. Subscribe to those values, and that's why I voted for this political party. Right in the middle of the term of office, or even at the beginning, my own party, my church, then decides, oh, we're going to go and lie in bed with this other political party, which I actually saw on the ballot paper. I chose not to vote for it. I chose not to vote for it. But somebody then decides that actually, for your own good, we need to be aligned to these ones. I've always struggled with that, and I've always asked myself how much of it is to the benefit, not of even the general public, but to the benefit of the person that put you in office.
Yeah. And most probably that conversation is one conversation that we will have to take forward as we start to begin to unpack the whole process of coalition governance, how it really came about and what we are seeing, unfold in the middle of governing parties in municipalities where ideologically they are completely on the other sides of the spectrum, but they conveniently come together to form a local government. And what is also very interesting about that is that when they conveniently form this marriage of inconvenience, they hardly consult the electorate who had put them into that powerful position of forming a coalition government. But anyway, Ebrahim, our time is up. We can talk about electoral systems and local democracy and local government the whole day, but there will be some other episodes, of course, that we wish you would actually join us in the future as we begin to unpack what is unfolding in local government linked to our electoral systems. So to my viewers out there, thank you so much for joining us for this very important episode. I hope our guest has given you some little bit of some background in understanding how electoral systems work in local government. And please do join us in the next episode where we will start looking at the municipal finances in local government. Please don't forget to subscribe to this channel, and we would also like to thank our sponsors, which is EPF, Empire Partner Foundation, for making this conversation happen. Next time. Thank you. Bye.